I'm a retired pastor here at Queen Street, United Methodist Church in Kinston, North Carolina. And glad to have you with us for our Bible study. Been away a bit, had to go baptize my great-granddaughter last week, so I was not here. But we're going to pick it up where we left off. And we're in Numbers chapter 25, the worship of Baal at Peor. What a horrible thing. Okay. All right. While Israel was staying at Shittim, the people began to have sexual relations with the women of Moab. Well, you're not supposed to do that. Okay. Shittim, by the way, we don't know exactly where it was. We know that the people were plains of Moab. I don't know if you can, yeah, I gotta move this over a little, just a tad. There we go, because we're on this side. Okay, plains of Moab are up here. Shittim is somewhere around there, okay, on the Transjordan side, okay. Shittim is another word for acacia, which is the kind of wood that was used to build the ark, and is also part of the wood that Noah used to build an ark. So, ark to ark. Anyway, that's all we know about the place. And it's in Moab. These invited the people to sacrifice to their gods, and the people ate and bowed down with their gods. Thus Israel yoked itself to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger was kindled against Israel. Well, yeah, sure enough. Okay, let's talk about what's going on here. For one thing, Baal was a Canaanite god of thunder that had to do with rain and replenishing the land. It was a fertility god, the primary god in Canaan, but he was not the Moabite god. So there's a disconnect here. Sharmesh, I think, was the Moabite god, and so they're hanging out with the Moabite women, but they're not. They're inviting them to bow down to Baal of Peor. There are lots of Baals, by the way. There's Baal of this and Baal of that. So anyway, looks like the Israelites are getting Baal. But they didn't get bailed out. All right.
I wonder
Now,
why God always uses the women. It seems
because
to me
they're good at it.
Well, every time a man is doing something, it seems like he's been led astray by a woman.
Exactly. And if you read the Quran, that's why women have to cover up and be modest and all of that,
So that
because
they
they are
won't
so
be tempted.
alluring.
Okay.
Yes, yes,
So is that the reason they have to cover?
yes,
Huh.
yes, because they are the great temptresses, and that's why they have to cover up. But they really have to cover up. I've lived in the country. They really have to cover up because the men are so privileged that they will take advantage of any situation. And women are such a disadvantage that no matter what happens, the first thing is, like if a woman is raped or something like that, the first thing they look at is whose fault was it? It's probably the woman enticed him to do it or something. The blame always goes to the woman. And only on certain circumstances can a woman defend herself. Like, for a rape, they've got to have like 2 witnesses that says she was raped. How do you do that? So it's just crazy. But understand that the Quran came out of our Old Testament. And so a lot of the ideas about gender responsibilities and things comes from our Old Testament. And our Old Testament is very specific that women will drive you to Baal. Okay?
Well, that's
I
a
was
shame.
just looking at Netflix. I was just telling Ann this week about, I said, women have had it so bad over history,
Yeah.
just like we're talking about. But yet, look at this church, what the women do.
Yeah.
It's just mind-boggling.
Well, that's right. And
And
I
some
mean,
churches
church,
they can't-
there would not be a church if it were not for the women in the
Yeah.
church. quite frankly. And this idea that women ought not to be ordained is so strange and bizarre. It should be to Christianity that, it's absurd. But the prejudices against women clergy and everything come from a lot of Old Testament understandings. All right. Now, I'm going to bring up something that I encountered. Okay, not with women. Okay. Okay. When I was doing disaster work, I headed an organization that started out as part of the North Carolina Council of Churches. And because of that, it was tied into the National Council of Churches. The National Council of Churches has a really good disaster recovery program, really good. And I relied on them a lot. But in order for me to be able to access the assets of the National Council of Churches, I had to go to training. And so they put on training events. And at one of these training events, they want people to understand diverse cultures and things like that. Because when you walk in, they don't want people, going in headbutting people over their religion. They want to do a Christian response to a disaster. Okay, well, there's some fine lines you got to watch out for. In this one training event, they had a Native American shaman from out west. Okay, and did a little background on the guy. He was living out of his car with his girlfriend. If you're talking about clergy in any denomination, that's kind of, sketchy. But anyway, he was going to put on a Native American ceremony, okay, which is pagan. Okay. Now there are a lot of, just like in Western Christianity, there are a lot of customs that have migrated into Christianity from pagan cultures, like Christmas trees and, things like that, Easter bunnies. There are things that have migrated in, okay? And there are a lot of things in Native American culture that have migrated into Christian worship. Doesn't mean that they are worshiping other gods. It means that they're just customs that have become Christianized in the Native community. This was not that. This was a totally pagan exercise. It wasn't sexual or anything like that, but there were a lot of smokes and feathers and spirits and stuff like that going on. Well, they wanted us to participate in it. So you get into a circle and you have the smoke thing and all that. And I said, wait a minute. Wait a minute. This is the National Council of what? Churches, right? Okay. Should we be doing pagan things? And most, they thought that was really cool. We got to do the smoke thing with the Native Americans and all, and fine, but you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to acknowledge the presence of, power of, anything of other gods. Just not. Okay. So I stood back as an observer, because I don't mind observing other things. I observed a lot of non-Christian activities, religious activities when I was living in Taiwan. But I didn't participate in them, okay? Now, to be honest, I brought back a number of artifacts that are not Christian from China, okay? But they are decorative to me. They are not things that I worship, Like I have a wooden Buddha. And but I don't do what the Chinese do, which is when the Buddha is supposed to report on what's going on in my household, I don't smear his face with honey so he can only say sweet things. I don't do that sort of. He's just sitting there so you can look at it and go, oh, that's an interesting carving. That's it. But these people were participating in pagan activities, okay, and they should know better as the people of God. So, thus Israel yoked itself to Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger was kindled against Israel, you think? The Lord said to Moses, take all the chiefs of the people and impale them in the sun before the Lord in order that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. Well, that's an awful way to die, okay? it's not just whacking them, you're going to stick them on a stick and let them rot in the sun. All right. This practice was actually outlawed in Israel. When they took over the land, they did not impale people and leave them to rot in the sun. And the reason for that was it was a contamination of the land to have that dead thing hanging around. All right? When the Romans took over and they started crucifying people, that was not just an execution to those people, that was an affront to their religion because they were contaminating the land with these corpses that were just hanging there and nobody was allowed to take them down. Now, an exception was made when Jesus was on the cross. The Jews went to Pilate and said, hey, look, it's Passover. This is not a good time to contaminate the land. Could we please take the bodies down? So Pilate allowed them to accelerate the execution. Apparently Jesus was already dead from the abuse he got before, but the other guys were alive and they broke their legs so that they could stop propping themselves up and breathing. And that way they would die faster and then they could get them down from the cross because they didn't want those dead things hanging around during Passover. Okay?
But that was just during Passover. If they had
Yes.
been Passover, they would have allowed it.
They wouldn't have had an excuse to ask for the bodies.
So, in essence, they're doing what the Old Testament, the pagans did in the Old Testament.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And the Romans were pagan.
And they didn't learn.
Well,
They were so slow.
the Romans were, what Romans did was indifferent to what the local religion was. Okay, that was Roman law. It superseded everything else. So anyway, this is an interesting thing that God didn't just want these people dead, he wanted them tortured to death. Okay, this is getting to be kind of a nasty God. And what he wants to do is to kill all the leaders. All right?
Isn't that what we want to do today?
Some people do. Okay? There's advocacy for that.
Yeah.
Take all the chiefs and impale them. And Moses said to the judges of Israel, who were supposed to be impaled, each of you shall kill any of your people who have yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor. So what Moses has done is modified it so that only the guilty are punished. God wanted to just do a general wipe out thing, whether you were guilty or not, okay? And Moses modified God's punishment to be only the guilty. But he
Once again, it seems like Moses
is more gracious
is
than,
gracious and more just and not a zealot. I mean, here again, and many times as we've gone through this, Moses seems to be the higher one, higher than God. I mean, God is jealous and irrational, and Moses is the one. It's almost like Moses wrote this, and I mean, really.
and you look at, okay, who did Moses marry?
Midianite,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay, he married a Midianite and an Ephraimite, an African. Okay?
He married twice.
Oh, more often than that, yeah. He was, yeah. Moses, multiple wives was not an issue. Having one from a culture and race outside of Israel was an issue. So here Moses is guilty basically of what he's being, these people are being accused of. And by rights, the judges should have killed him too.
Okay, wait a minute, go back. So Moses was guilty like that, and tell me again, why?
Well, he wasn't really, because the prohibition on intermarriage was not in place
Okay,
the
you're saying
first time
because
he got married.
Because he married outside.
Yeah,
Okay, gotcha. All
yeah,
right.
okay. All right, and then just to make matters worse, just then one of the Israelites came and brought a Midianite woman into his family in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation, flaunting, while they were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting, because they were, they're trying to repent, and here this guy shows up with another floozy from another culture, okay? And when Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest saw it, so this is Phinehas. Phinehas is the grandson of Aaron, okay? And the name Phinehas means dark-skinned, okay? Son of Aaron, the priest saw it. He got up and left the congregation, taking a spear in his hand. He went after the Israelite man into the tent and pierced the two of them, the Israelite and the woman, through the belly. Let's be specific here. So the plague was stopped, and now there's a plague. The plague wasn't mentioned before.
But was it the plague of sexual pleasure?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
I've always thought that.
And it didn't stop.
Yep, keep me sick. So,
Then it says the plague of 24,000 died.
yeah, 24,000 people
I don't know how
died.
many people die from sexual pleasure.
Well, I don't know. Maybe so.
I'm just saying.
It depends. It depends on who you're having sex with, I guess, and how healthy they are, and all that. Anyway, the plague wasn't mentioned as part of the punishment. Okay, and it seems to be just a general plague. Okay, so when Phinehas kills these two, it stops the plague. God is appeased. All right. This is, not the, I mean, you got to really wonder. Okay.
You really do.
Nevertheless, those who died by the plague were 24,000. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by manifesting such zeal among them on my behalf that in my jealousy I did not consume the Israelites. So here this is a God who does not contain his emotions very well. We're talking about a God who is in many respects capricious and spreads blame. All right, this is a more jealous God than a just God
At this point.
at this point. Okay, so we need to be careful when we start saying, "Oh, well, it's in the Bible. It's, God can do all these." It just, we've had time to digest some of this stuff down through the centuries, and our perception of God today is quite different from the perception they had of God back
This
then.
is their perception.
This is their perception.
That's what it is, a perception.
Yes.
So it really makes it hard to be a Christian and follow what you think is the Word of God. Because when you start getting into this, it just seems so irrational.
If the Old Testament were a perfect representation of God, we would not have needed Jesus.
Why? Because he would have killed us all.
Well, if it was a perfect representation of God, God would not have felt the need to re-represent himself to us so that we would understand better the character of God.
So in the New Testament, he was redeeming himself.
Well, okay. God is not redeemed.
Can he
Okay.
redeem himself?
No, doesn't need to.
So is God
But he's showing a different face.
Yes,
so
yes.
is God misrepresented in the Old Testament?
I think so, because I don't
It's
think,
like a totally different person in the Old Testament and the New Testament.
yes,
But I'm speaking for myself.
yeah,
If you read and study the scripture, and we're not in this class,
okay,
okay? I read it, I study it, I move on.
right. Yes, because you're
You know,
reading,
you
because
say-
you're reading the Bible,
Right.
and you're reading the Bible uncritically.
But see, there are people like me that read that and I don't move on.
Okay, and that's a good point. No, that's an,
Because when I read it, I think, really? I mean, really?
yes, that's right. Now, let's take a look at what's going on here, okay? because there has been such a reliance by people in the church down through the ages to these Old Testament prohibitions, okay? The people of God, in quotes, have been sometimes virulently anti-mixed marriage. That's where the racial intermarriage laws came from, especially in the South. Okay, now there were those in the North too. Okay, I can't tell you that it was any more acceptable in the North than it was in the South. All right?
Here.
No, well, depending on where you were.
Some of the most prejudiced people I have ever met in my life were from the North.
Yes. Oh, I agree. I agree.
My father was from upstate New York, and I never encountered it in his family, but I encountered it in people around him.
Yes. Yeah, very strong. And not just against one particular race. That's the thing. In New York, you had a whole variety of races that you could be prejudiced against.
Well,
Okay?
I'm not talking about New York City, I'm talking about the state,
Yeah,
upstate New York,
yeah.
farm country.
Right. But here's the problem. Here's the problem. Okay? The reason why there was a prohibition on mixed marriages in the Old Testament was that these were people who worshiped other gods. It had much more to do with other gods than it had to do with the racial issue. Okay? Now, I'm not saying the racial issue was not an important aspect of this or component of it. But the main reason why God got mad at them was not because they were messing around with Moabite women. God was angry at them because the Moabite women were able to get them to worship Baal.
So it wasn't God wasn't, it wasn't a racial thing in the first place, ever. We've made it that way.
God was not jealous of the Moabite women. God was jealous of Baal.
But he shouldn't be.
Well, no, God doesn't want you messing around with the pagan religions.
So technically, you can still blame women, right?
I often do. But I'm just getting them back. That's all.
I just threw that out.
I'm glad.
You think this is a reason that a lot of times the New Testament is not preached?
I think
the Old Testament. The Old Testament, not-
people who want to have racist ideas will go to the Old Testament more than they will go to the New Testament.
Can you say that the difference between God in the Old Testament and God in the New Testament was when he became a parent? Is that right?
Well, God was always a parent. Jesus was always there.
Yeah.
Okay. Jesus is an
Well,
inherent
But when
aspect of
Jesus
God.
was born,
But we always say God is the same yesterday, today, and always.
Yeah, I think we changed though.
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
I mean, I don't get that. I mean, I know the saying, you know, he was the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, forever. But this seems like a different person in the Old Testament.
Well, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, but the portrayal of God has changed radically.
So the writing
So that's the thing, that it's the writing of.
And so, and
Yeah.
this-
It's
and
the
I hate,
perspective of the different groups of people that have seen it in different lights and have written it their way.
There is only one prohibition on intermarriage in the New Testament, and there is an advisory, not a law, an advisory, do not be unequally yoked together with non-believers. But there is also an advisory that you just don't up and divorce them because they're different in their beliefs. Okay? It is the objective is not that you will divorce, the objective is that you will convert them. Okay? And that your influence on a spouse of a different faith could be their salvation. That's what the New Testament says. There is no prohibition in the New Testament about interracial marriage at all whatsoever. There are advisories about people intermarrying with people who are not of the same faith.
Well, we as people surely do look about it differently, because you can think about it, Jewish people don't want their heirs to marry somebody that's not Jewish. And if I'm a Christian, I want my family to marry somebody that's Christian.
Yeah. I had an interesting discussion with one of our volunteers. First time I really worked with the guy. He's been with our center for a long time, but he does deliveries, and I'm not out there with him doing deliveries, so I don't, you know. But he's black, and he grew up in Jim Crow, and he said, you know, there was only one thing where we agreed with the Klan, and that was they didn't want interracial marriage on either side.
And that's true.
Yes, it's true.
It's still true today.
Well, in many respects, it is. I know that I had a couple in my church where there was an interracial marriage, and in fact, I performed it. And they went to the Collard Festival, and you know, this white guy who married a black woman was set upon by a gang of blacks because he was married to a black woman. And I mean, they really beat him up. But you know, the idea that racism goes one way is just absurd, just absolutely absurd. I've seen it all over the world.
My son is, one of his best friends is black.
Uh-huh.
And I was down there a couple of years ago, and I asked, we were sitting around the dinner table talking, and I said, Chris, I want to ask you something, and I don't mean this ugly. Please don't think I do. I just don't know. I'm not close enough to many black people to ask them. I said, are black people as prejudiced as some white people? He said, oh my God, Miss Norma, he said, I think black people are more prejudiced than white in the South, is what he said.
Well, that's not just in the South, okay? People, I think it's a fair statement to say that generally speaking, people have ideas about race.
Absolutely.
Okay? Some of those are negative. And it doesn't matter what race you are, okay? But my advice is, no matter what race you are, don't live down to your enemy's expectations. So if the presumption is that I'm going to be racist because I am a white male, or sexist because I am a white male, the thing that I don't want to do is to portray myself as either one of those. Okay? And I want to have a genuine, not just because I'm fighting a stereotype, I want to have a genuine openness to people across lines. And I don't want to live down to the expectations of those who hate me. Why give validity to their assumptions? And that it doesn't matter what race you are. There are assumptions that are made about you. I mean, when I lived in China, talk about racist. I mean, they liked Americans generally, but they liked Americans primarily because we brought assets into their society. But if it came to an interracial marriage or something like that, they were probably not very happy about it. I know that there was a tremendous amount of prejudice in Chinese society, and not just between, this white and Chinese. It was, Southern Chinese and Northern Chinese and Western Chinese. And you see it happening now where they're committing genocide against the Uyghurs in Western China. These are Chinese people, okay? And they're Muslim, but the Chinese government is annihilating them and annihilating their culture. So, and they're doing the same thing in Tibet, all right? So there is this, racism is not confined, it's not binary, okay? There's a lot more going on in the world, believe me, right now. You look at what's going on in the streets with the Palestinian demonstrators and the anti-Semitism that you see now. It's just horrible. It's totally irrational. I mean, these kids are walking around like brown shirts, and they're despicable, absolutely despicable, and there are a lot of them. But But just because they're wearing the keffiyeh doesn't mean that they weren't Antifa in the last demonstration or Black Lives Matter in the last demonstration. My background in intelligence and working for the National Guard in demonstrations and stuff, these people just put on a different hat. Same ones,
They get the money from the same people.
and they get their money from the same people. Essentially, if you want to see what's going on with these people, they are essentially all Marxists. That's the one common thread that you see through all of it is they're Marxist. So anyway, so
They're Marxists?
yes. Okay, so what's going on? I gotta speed up here. What's going on here is that God says that I really like Phineas, and your people. Phineas basically was the administrator over the Levites, who were like the enforcers. And he says, because you've done this, then irrevocably your generations will always hold this office. Okay? There are several places where God makes an irrevocable promise. Promise to Abraham, promise to David, okay, promise to Aaron, promise to, irrevocable forever.
But Phineas was the grandson of Aaron. And
Yeah.
Aaron his family had already been
Yes, but he would always have the office of being the big
the
enforcer.
big, okay.
Yeah, so the generations following Phineas would be the enforcers of the law. Okay. And then they go into who Phineas killed, which kind of nails this really did happen, because I got the names of the people that he killed. And then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, harass the Midianites and defeat them, for they have harassed you by trickery, using women, with which they deceived you in the affair of Peor and in the affair of Cosbi, the daughter of a leader of Midian, their sister. She was killed on the day of the plague that resulted from Peor. Now, one of the things you need to know about the plague is that that plague was the final act that wiped out the first generation that came out of Egypt. Okay, because the next chapter we go into a census of who's left. Okay, and we'll talk about that in the next lesson. But I think it's important for us to keep these things in perspective and understand that we're dealing with a very ancient, very primitive culture whose perceptions of God. Understand also that they are a subsistence people. Anything that happens can cost your life. Bang. Okay? They are extremely vulnerable. And so anything that happens, especially on a mass scale, is going to be looked at as a punishment from the God. Okay? And so they live in a harsh situation, and you could die quick. When we get into the census, they don't even count kids that are under a month old because they expect them to die. So, we're looking at an extremely vulnerable society where everything scares them and they can't explain what's going on, earthquakes and storms and locusts and, all of this. They think God is in control of everything. God is, okay, so it must be God's fault. God's angry at us for doing something.
So they live in fear every day,
They live in fear every day.
just like the women live in Iran.
Yes.
But every day they wake up, will I live through the rest of the
Will I live, especially in Afghanistan?
And there are people today who feel the hurricanes and the tornadoes and the fires and the.
Yes, and
floods are from
yes,
God.
and they know that New Orleans is such an evil place that, of course, there are going to be hurricanes hitting New Orleans, because it's just the nature of sin. Okay. Anyway, well, God bless you. Thanks for being a part of the study today. I hope it was informative. The next chapter is about genealogies and census and stuff. We're going to go through kind of on the top level of it, because it gets really tedious. But there are lessons to be learned from it as well, and I want to bring those out. So see you next week. Okay.
Thank you.